Well, let's explore maybe a couple different parts of, I think, that question, because there's, definitely a lot of pieces that kind of go together to build this puzzle, um, at least in my observation. Because when let's say we're evangelicals and we're getting really frustrated at the ground level because, it just seems like things are scattered. It seems like lack cohesiveness. It lacks rootedness. And so then we start reading, and we read about the Orthodox Church, and we read about, its sense of continuity. We read this or that theologian, and like they give this vision, and then they say, but of course, there's always, like difficulties in local parishes, right? So we have the difficulties in the local parishes, our local parish, and our thought experiment here. We're evangelical, we're getting upset. And like those difficulties in the parish, we're not overlooking. Those are actually energizing and motivating our looking at the Orthodox Church. But we read about the Orthodox Church and we say, well, yeah, of course, there's going to be difficulties. And so we go in with that sense that we're going to kind of ignore those difficulties because we've read about the ideal and we already know that there's going to be difficulties. And so we end up having this kind of, I'm going to be realistic about the difficulties in the evangelical church, but I'm going to overlook those in the Orthodox Church as I go in there because I'm going to focus and hang on to the idealized theoretical aspect that the Orthodox Church supposedly preserves. Which is why there is a phenomenon in Orthodox churches that after about 5 to 10 years, a lot of evangelicals leave. Former evangelicals leave. People who had converted to the Orthodox Church, they spend so much time there.
Oh, really? So, because I've been personally very well, I've known a lot, at least in the online spheres, of like tons and tons of evangelicals going to Orthodoxy. But you're saying that many of those converts end up leaving again just because they have this idealized picture that doesn't come true.
Well, the fullness of the Orthodox Church, it can take about 5 to 10 years for a person to kind of digest it and look around and realize that actually the exact same problems that was having in the evangelical churches are here too, just in a slightly different configuration.
No,
And
okay, okay.
and the Holy Orthodox Church, according to their claims, their own claims about themselves, because they're the only one Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. They're not just the one Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. They're the only one Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. And so they end up, unfortunately, in my opinion, rhetorically creating a situation in which they should put their money where their mouth is at the parish level. If they are what they claim to be, they should not appear and create the same problems that your local evangelical church has.
Right.
But the amount of infighting, the amount of bickering in parishes, the amount of legalism, the amount of sensualism, the amount of secularism, the amount of liberalism. I had people complaining to me, and they would hate their conservative Orthodox parish, and they'd say all the people who liked Trump were a bunch of Trumpanzees. And then this person, though, swore that they represented authentic orthodoxy. And so, it's like you have just incredible bickering, old calendar versus new calendar, old believers, the genuine Orthodox Church, the Greeks versus the Moscow people, versus the Russian Orthodox. And so, like the incredible amount of infighting that is there, and then even down to the parish level of gossip and fighting and infighting, and you have the liberals who are trying to, create a female diaconate in the churches that some people think is great, and then other people think is a real big problem, and it would divide the church because the monks in Mount Athos aren't going to go for it, and so it would cause a schism to do those things, but the other people don't care. Bishops writing in defense of, 21st century sexual ethics, And so you have all of these sorts of things happening in Orthodoxy. But when you read about Orthodoxy in Alexander Schmemann and his kind of idealized, for the life of the world, his view of like, the Eucharist, his view of the liturgy, but then you go among Russian Orthodox Christians outside of Russia, and they say, "Oh, Father Alexander Schmemann was an innovator. We actually don't respect his writings, and who was he? He's just trying to reinvent Orthodoxy according to his own, innovation of neo-patristic synthesis." And it was just his lever. It was his way of creating a gap in Orthodox consensus to kind of put his own, view into things and change things. And, they're trying to change out of Old Church Slavonic into English is an enormous controversy. And so all of that, when you get down to the actual piety of people, you find that still people don't pray their morning prayers. They don't pray their evening prayers. Can't tell you how many people would come to the confessional and say, "Father, I don't really commit any sins," and it's like, if you're an evangelical and you're entering into the Orthodox Church overlooking all of that stuff because you realize that there is no perfect parish, it's going to take you about 5 to 10 years to be like, I don't know, as one old preacher said, you're either a saint or you ain't. You're either being the church or you're not being the church. And so when you have this idealized only one holy Catholic and apostolic church but the parish isn't doing that, like you went out of the evangelical church because you needed to be fed. You went into the Orthodox church because you needed to be fed. And then after 5 to 10 years and you realize that there's maybe worse bickering. Now you don't just have like people who've been fighting, families who've been fighting for 50 years. You have families who've been fighting for generations. You have centuries old debates. And now you're going to be, well, I think I'm going to be a truer Orthodox. I'm going to go old believer. Well, now I'm going to be genuine Orthodox church. And there's only a handful of parishes in the whole planet that are even really true. Why are all these Orthodox churches in the World Council of Churches? They're all just ecumenists. And so they've all capitulated to secularism and ecumenism. And so I think having like that real world experience in an Orthodox parish and you realize that they're really the same. And for me, the critical thing, it's like, I want to be around Jesus people who put Jesus first, because, being in some environments with Orthodox Christians, they don't put Jesus first. Some put liturgy first. Some put tradition first. Some put, who knows what they put first. Some people just put, whatever they sell locally, whether it's, whether, I don't know what the Greeks sell, maybe, but in their festivals, they'll put festivals first, or if you're Russian, maybe you'll put pierogies first, and then you'll have the group that does the pierogies, and then they're the ones who wield the power. And if things are happening in the church that the pierogi group doesn't like, that makes a whole stink, and everybody's fighting, and everybody has to capitulate to what the pierogi group wants because they're the ones who pay the bills, but they don't necessarily love Jesus. They don't even necessarily go to church. And so, what does it mean to be church? So if you leave the evangelical church because you want to go to something that's actually being the church, because, just going and having a beautiful service only lasts you so long.
Right. So to answer the question then of whether an evangelical, like not one who's leaving evangelicalism, but like they're wanting to fix stuff in their own evangelical congregation. They're wanting to counteract a lot of the hyper-individualist, pietistic, rootless, anti-traditional culture that can thrive up and all. You would say that looking towards looking at orthodoxy really to try and find some answers for that, they're not really going to find some answers for that, or
I don't think so. They may answer, the problem with the right hand and then just create a worse problem with the left. Or they're trying to avoid, spraining their ankle, but they end up spraining their wrist. And it's like, either way, a person needs to be in a church that's being the church. Now, if they're Orthodox and they're in an Orthodox church that's being the church, praise God. That's a beautiful place to be. But if you're in an evangelical church and you're among something that's being churched, then praise God. And don't look at the problems, as, well, I'm going to go to the church that doesn't have this problem so that I can go to a church that has 100 other problems. Just try to be the church.